and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RO-DBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Marielle Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. Welcome to episode 8 of the Skillful podcast. Today I'm talking with Neill Howell, a psychotherapist in the San Francisco Bay Area who specializes in working with people who have too much self-control, or over-control as we talk about it. We'll define what exactly over-control is, how RO-DBT is a treatment designed to help with over-control, and why the suffering of folks who have too much self-control can often get missed. So welcome, Neill.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to have you on today because on the podcast, we've been talking a lot about emotional dysregulation. And I wanted to begin to introduce listeners to the flip side or the converse. So we have folks in the world who are emotionally dysregulated, or we might say are under controlled with their emotions. And you're really knowledgeable in folks who are over controlled with their emotions. So I was hoping that we could begin defining what over-control looks like and really get into the nitty-gritty about it. So can you get us started in defining how you think about over-control?
Well, sure. Yeah. So over-control would be something along the lines of maybe someone who's really good at maybe doing things well or doing things the right way. They maybe will often show up to meetings on time and prepared, or maybe they have kind of like they always eat the right foods, but they've got a good at being able to do the things that most of us are supposed to do. Okay. And that's all good, but sometimes there can be too much of a good thing. And so people that suffer from over-control can be maybe so caught up in like having that right diet plan and always getting the right exercise that they're always rushed and maybe kind of uptight. And it can start to interfere in their ability to relax or enjoy life or just have good relationships, connect with people.
Would you say another way of thinking about over-control is perfectionism? Is there some overlap there?
Yeah, I'd say there would be some overlap. I wouldn't say it would be synonymous, but I think that if there can be a quality of kind of compulsive striving where you're always trying to get to the next goal and always trying to do things better and maybe having a hard time sitting back and going, wow, I just did a really great job.
So folks who are over-controlled have a hard time appreciating themselves and maybe slowing down as well.
Yeah, I think you could probably say that. I would imagine so, yeah.
Because when I think about over-control, one of the places my mind goes are folks who externally can look like they sort of have it all together.
Yeah.
Where they're doing the things that society requires of us or likes or approves of. So these can be the overachievers.
Yeah.
The people who look like they're not really struggling too much, that they kind of, they meet their deadlines, they have the correct, as you said, sort of diet and exercise plan. They look like they sort of have it all together, but we know that there's a hidden side.
Well, yeah. So one of the things about over-control is that over-control people are really good at not displaying their emotion. So we can be in significant distress, and I lean towards over-control myself, so that's why I use we. And I find that I can be good at not letting people know what I'm feeling inside. Maybe having a neutral expression or having an expression that doesn't match what I'm really feeling, so it's kind of incongruent. And because we also have control of our emotions in that way, we're not displaying them as they come up all the time. Other people may not know that we're struggling or that we're suffering.
So it's much more hidden because one of the things that folks who lean towards over control is their emotional expression, as you said. So someone who's under control tends to be more out there if they're having a hard time. so that, it might be more visible. You might be able to read it on their face and in their body language if they're angry or sad. And so
Yeah.
someone who's over controlled might have more of a flat affect.
It can be a flat affect. There can also be a component where, so there are three parts that make up over control. So there's kind of biological component, which is like genetic. And so it usually starts showing up when somebody is pretty young and they can be kind of shy as a kid. It's a temperamental thing. So it kind of starts out early on and then it tends to stay with you in different forms throughout your life. It doesn't change so much from one age to another. And part of that temperament can be a heightened threat sensitivity. So over control people are really aware of all of the problems and all the things that could go wrong. The expression that Dr. Tom Lynch has for this that I think puts it so well is that they can walk into a rose garden and see all of the thorns. And so being over controlled, we may be feeling a lot of distress and we may be kind of aware of all the things that are going on. And that awareness of what's going on keeps us in a state of maybe anxiety or tension. And
sort of scanning for danger or the problems with this
right.
analogy of the rose garden, and you see what's dangerous, the thorns.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Yeah. And so that can make us kind of tense people.
Yeah.
Right?
That does create a lot of anxiety. I think that and we'll get into this, how people who are over controlled can get really rewarded by the world, because we need folks out there who are scanning for danger.
Yeah.
Right? But if that's where you are almost all the time, it can be really hard to relax, it sounds like, or experience pleasure.
Yeah, there can be a habitual part to it. So I mentioned there are three parts. There's the biological or genetic, and then there is kind of the environmental factor that plays a role. So if you receive a message a lot as a child that mistakes are intolerable or that you could always do better, things like that. And then there's kind of, if you've got this genetic predisposition and you've got these messages from the environment, you kind of lean on coping strategies that become habitual over time. So maybe noticing threat and then being prepared for what could go wrong becomes a habit automatically. And then kind of not displaying emotion is a part of that. We have kind of, that's built into the genetic component of it as well, is a better ability to delay gratification and not display emotion. So we're also not getting the feedback from the environment that under control people get, that, hey, your emotion's too much, tone it down a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Instead, what over control people get is, it seems like they're fine. Maybe they're a little uptight, but they're not making a big scene. And so maybe everything's okay.
You and I have talked about this before, about how under control people, because they get that feedback from people around them, because they're much more out there and intense with their emotions, that as they get older, they tend to get better. They tend to reduce some of that under control and actually learn how to be more in charge of their emotion and their reactions. But for over control people, something different can happen if it's not attended to. Maybe you can speak to that. What happens for over control people as they age if they're not getting that feedback?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting is that I think for over control people, it can get worse. So we can over rely on over controlled strategies of scanning the environment for threat and then thinking about how to deal with it if that threat were to happen, and kind of staying tense and being super diligent and getting your taxes done on time and always doing things the right way, following rules.
Mm-hmm.
We can often end up isolated and alone, and that can lead to a variety of problems. It can lead to a depression, it can lead to obsessive compulsive personality disorder, it can lead to eating disorders. Really have a severe impact on life.
Yeah. And the suffering is much more hidden usually. So people will come in to see you, it sounds like, who have a variety of things that they're coming in with. Let me state this differently. My guess is that over control people aren't coming in to see you and saying, I follow the rules too much, I'm too uptight, that they're saying things more like, I'm depressed, or I'm lonely, I can't seem to make friends or find a partner, or I'm really rigid about my eating.
Yeah. So I think Often, actually, for me, a number of people that are finding me because they've been through a bunch of other therapies and they didn't help.
Yeah.
And they're finding like, okay, here's a different approach. And when they learn a little bit more about RO-DBT and over control, they start to maybe have a light that goes off that goes, oh, this sounds like me.
Right. Finally, something is
Right.
explaining what's
Yeah.
happening with me. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I think many therapies are built on giving people strategies to address problems, to cope. And those strategies can be a way of kind of controlling the symptoms. And when you're over controlled, you don't need more control.
Right. It's the last thing you need.
Right. Right. So we kind of have to go about this treatment in a different way, because just giving them more strategies to deal with giving them control over things isn't going to help address the underlying problem when you're over controlled.
It makes me think of, and this was not in a DBT or RO-DBT framework, but years ago, when I was first training as a therapist, I had a supervisor who said, some people need glue and other people need solvent. And I think, the OC folks need some solvent. They need some melting. And so OC, the over controlled, and the UC or the under controlled folks need some glue.
Oh, I really like that. That's neat.
Yeah. It has stayed with me all these years.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that fits. Yeah.
Yeah. So, let's switch gears and just go in a bit more into the emotional loneliness that folks who struggle with over control experience, because that is a huge piece of the suffering that is hidden.
Right. The thing about RO-DBT is that we don't want to be giving people more tools to give them control, because kind of compulsive habitual control responses are part of the problem. And you can't really use control to address control, right? So we have to come about it in a kind of a backwards way. And I think that one of the cool things about this treatment is instead of focusing on what's wrong with a person, we focus on what's right in all of us. And that we as humans, we're tribal animals. We would not have survived in nature without being a member of a tribe. And we need connection, and we need a sense of belonging and friends and people we can be honest and intimate with that let us know that we're okay. And when we're over controlled, we can end up really isolated and alone. We can have really kind of rigid ways of living life that interfere in the flexibility needed to have friendships. And I think that often many over-controlled people have a deep-seated fear that they're just not very likable people.
Like deep down inside, if people got to know them, they wouldn't like them.
Yeah. So part of what we do here is we help over-controlled people to come back into the tribe, to let them know that they can relax and they don't have to keep working so hard, that all of the over-controlled things that people do are innately pro-social. So it's, over-controlled people that build bridges that don't fall down and got us to the moon and so forth. But that, like I said earlier, there can be too much of a good thing. And sometimes it's important to be able to just relax and join the tribe and chill out and have some fun and lighten up a little bit. And that's a part of what this gets to, is helping people to recognize that it is important to have connections in life and have intimacy, that it's maybe even more important than always eating right or always being on time or always having your house clean or whatever it is, the rigid rules that we can create for ourselves sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I love that about RO-DBT, because I think it's quite unique in that it is really bringing in the common humanity piece. We're all part of a tribe, and focusing on easing the emotional loneliness that folks who are over controlled struggle with, versus let's address what they're, in therapy language, we'd call the presenting issue. Let's address the depression or the anorexia. We're talking in RO-DBT about let's help people connect with others. And that in and of itself will be healing and will shift things.
Yeah, that's what we find. The research shows that if you take your attention off of the symptoms, instead put it on what are you signaling by what you're doing? And what do you want to be signaling? What are your values for the person you want to be in this situation? That it improves quality of life, and the symptoms tend to go away without directly manipulating them, the problems that brought people in. And one of the really cool things about this is some research is showing that people that go through a course of RO-DBT treatment continue improving after they leave treatment.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
So it sort of builds on itself.
Right.
And I also in RO-DBT, they talk about, because I think this is important if anyone's listening who identifies as over control and might feel very emotionally lonely, they're not saying to get better that you have to have a whole gaggle of friends around you. They're really talking about, at least one person that you can be real with and intimate and vulnerable.
Right. Yeah. And that also brings to mind that, the cool thing about this treatment is we're not saying that you're bad or wrong for being over controlled and you need to stop doing that.
Yeah, right. That doesn't work.
Right. We're kind of saying no, we just need to be able to learn how to be flexible at those times when we're inclined to be kind of rigid. And we've got some really interesting ways to help people do that.
Really creative ways with the skills.
Yeah. There's a really neat mindfulness practice that's a part of this that is unlike anything I've ever seen, and I just love it. And it's really interesting.
Can you share some about that?
Yeah.
What's the name of the skill?
It's called self-inquiry, and it has its roots in a Sufi tradition. And so the idea with this is that nobody knows everything. I don't know everything, and neither does anyone else. I did say everything, right? I don't know everything, and neither does anyone else. So that means that there's always something to learn. And the problem when you're over controlled is that we can get stuck in one of two kind of mindsets. There's fixed mind, which is kind of like there's only one way to do things and they have to be done that way. And then there's fatalistic mind, which is kind of like nothing's ever going to work. And both of those mindsets tend to be kind of rigid. So one of the things we do with this mindfulness practice is helping people to identify when they're feeling some tension, some rigidity, some irritation or frustration, and then see if there isn't something to learn in that moment. And so the practice, the inclination for an over-control person would, if you consider, well, is there something for me to learn here, would be, okay, well, it must be this, and kind of call it done, when you're really just reinforcing what you already know rather than actually being open for new learning to take place. So the practice is to use the discomfort of what we call the edge to be a flag that maybe there's an opportunity for learning to take place here. And then finding a question that helps you stay at the edge so that you can enable the learning to take place.
That's really fascinating. I love the process of self-inquiry, and I appreciate how you've described it here. And I'm wondering for our listeners if we could bring it to life with an example.
This is kind of a neat practice. It's only about 5 minutes long when you do it. And you start out by noticing what's the discomfort. And so I took care of my 89-year-old mom the other day and found that she had not taken her medications as she was supposed to. And I got irritated with her, and then afterwards I was feeling uncomfortable about being irritated with her for having not taken her medications. And when I go to consider if there's some learning for me around this emotion I have around what's going on with my mom not taking her pills, I come up with a question of, why do I think she's so fragile? That me being irritated is going to harm her or something like that. Or what makes me think she's so fragile, I think was the question I came up with. So the nice thing about that question is that it keeps the intensity of emotion alive for me so that I'm not just shutting it down with a quick answer, but it's also keeping it kind of in the back of my mind so that learning can take place. And what I'm finding with this practice is that over time, it's enabling learning to take place that wasn't happening in other mindfulness and journaling practices that I've experimented with over the last 20 years.
Because it's such an opening kind of practice.
Yeah.
And it's asking you to go deeper rather than other mindfulness practices where they're just asking you to sort of notice and let it go.
Yeah, I think as an over-controlled person, sometimes having a blank mind can become kind of a perfectionist thing. And the nice thing about this practice is that it can help us to practice being flexible and changing our response from to irritation or discomfort or a variety of emotions from an habitual coping response to a opening up response.
Mm-hmm. And you said something a moment ago that I want to highlight in terms of how it enables you or anyone who's over control to learn. And so one piece around the over control personality style is that there's a shut off in the learning. I don't know if that there's somehow learning gets truncated because the internal process around questioning or wondering gets shut down.
Well, I think that's kind of my understanding of part of what happens is that an over-controlled coping response would be something along the lines of what we call approach coping. So there's avoidance coping, which would be, oh no, there's a problem, I'll go do something else and maybe it will go away.
Yeah, I've been there.
Right. And then there's approach coping where it's kind of like, oh, there's a problem, I've got to find a solution. And that need to immediately find a solution all the time can interfere in staying open for a better solution to happen. So an example that they give would be like if the washing machine breaks down and, immediately going online and ordering one, and then the next day when it's delivered and they're installing it, finding out that, oh, it's just a clogged pipe and the old machine is fine. It's kind of like, if you don't so quickly go to solve problems, sometimes that's actually better than immediately solving every problem.
Right. So that fix it mentality, there's a problem, let me fix it immediately, really is part of what shuts down the learning.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And in order to be able to not fix a problem immediately, one has to be somewhat comfortable with discomfort because we don't know. Maybe if depending, the washing machine is one example, but if it has to do with a relationship, that can be pretty murky territory. And if there's a quick rush to fix things, we shut off a whole bunch of possibilities prematurely.
Right. So the example I'm thinking of as you're saying that would be if someone receives negative feedback from the environment, from another person in their lives. An approach coping response could be something like, well, see, that just goes to prove that I can't trust people.
Right.
People cannot be trusted, right?
Yeah.
And if you can stay open to learning, you may find as you're getting some feedback there that could be helpful, like maybe my way of being in the world is influencing how people respond to me. And that can be a kind of a scary and hard thing to admit. But, if I'm borrowing lots of metaphors from the treatment protocol, but if you kind of wake up one morning and find that you're in a purple house and you hate the color purple, well, acknowledging that it's purple is the first step towards changing it.
Right.
So finding out that if something that you're doing is impacting how other people are responding to you, rather than attributing it to that people can't be trusted, but maybe that there's something you can do that would enable you to have the relationships you want in your life, could be really helpful information.
Yeah. I think about how it's also humbling, especially for people who are over controlled, who really want to get it right all the time.
We do.
Yeah. I want to make sure we have time to talk about the concept of emotional leakage, because often I'll meet people where I have a sense that they might fall on the over control continuum. And they'll say, that can't be me because I just screamed at my husband the other day and slammed a door during a fight. And I think that this is another piece of the over control, because so much is sort of behind closed doors, where the person can look like they really have it together. They don't lose their cool when they're out in public to the world. But emotional leakage, which is the term we use in RO-DBT, is somewhat commonplace and to be expected. Can you expand just a little bit on what emotional leakage looks like?
Yeah, well, so I think the definition for it is something along the lines of expressing emotion at an intensity that is more than a person is comfortable with. So, let's say, for example, let's say I'm an over control person and I am rushing around to get everything done, and I'm very stressed because I might be late to an appointment or something like that. And I've got to go to a grocery store and someone's cart is blocking the aisle. And instead of, asking them to move it and maybe being a little bit irritated, I'd yell at them at the top of my lungs or something like that. That could be a product of putting myself under a lot of pressure, and maybe also a result of kind of not expressing a lot of emotion for a long time and having a lot of pent up frustration and irritation and so forth.
So it comes out with a really strong intensity because there's been so much kind of suppressing it.
It can be that. It can also be for over control people. Sometimes what they feel is a really strong, abrupt signal isn't seen that way by other people because we're so used to keeping emotions calm and controlled that it might seem to us that we've gone way over the top, but the other person isn't experiencing it that way.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying what someone who's over controlled might consider emotional leakage. It may feel that way to them, like they've really crossed a line, but it may not actually appear that way to others.
Right. I'm trying to think if I can give you a good example. Yeah, maybe something like feeling like they went way over the top and raged at someone for something they had done and if you ask them to show what it looks like, they looked at the person in the eye and said, "Would you please move out of my way?" And so in their mind, they're thinking that that was a really intense expression of emotion, but it may have not been perceived like that by the other person.
Right. So there's a mismatch between what the over-controlled person is experiencing, because for them, it's really sort of crossing a line. It's outside of their comfort zone. A
Yeah.
mismatch between that and what's being received in the environment or by the other person.
I think there can be. Yeah. I think it goes kind of in both ways. But in either scenario, I think your point of that, it's so uncomfortable, distressing for us that this happens, that for us it feels like, oh, we have a problem. We need to control our emotions more. Our emotions are under controlled, when actually it's the opposite. It's a product of having too much emotional control and not just letting emotions be.
Right. Letting them sort of naturally flow through.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there can be, it sounds like, shame and self-judgment and a desire to clamp down more when some of this emotional leakage happens.
Right. I think so.
So the RO-DBT treatment really kind of normalizes and actually says, no, like we're needing more loosening, more solvent or flexibility here around emotions.
Yeah, I think so. I think a part of it is working on being authentic or congruent in emotion. So enabling, sometimes with having a close relationship with someone, it may mean not speaking your mind if it's not going to help in that moment. And then there are times when it may be important to speak your mind, even if it's may not be what the other person wants to hear, but it's the truth. And so part of this is learning to be flexible in those scenarios and doing the one that may be more uncomfortable for you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the RO-DBT treatment is asking people so often to do what's uncomfortable. I guess we might say that about therapy in general, in the hopes that over time it will become more comfortable and people will get closer to leading the lives they want.
Well, I would say if anyone that's listening to this is considering whether or not they might be over control, we have some really good assessment materials to help with that. And there are now a lot of therapists that are trained in this approach. And so you can find someone that can help you to determine if you might benefit from this. It's a really fun treatment. I really love doing this. And so it's, we've talked about having to do some challenging things and kind of go against your habits and so forth. But the way we go about it is so much fun that I think it's really enjoyable. And it's, I think, my favorite approach.
It really clicks for you. And I would concur in that there's playfulness and lightness in this treatment approach. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We're bringing those qualities in that we want for folks who identify as over control. We're bringing that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. We kind of have to not just talk about it, but actually do it.
Do it. Right. In the moment. Yes. So, Neill, can you tell listeners how they can find you online?
Sure. So my website is www.neillhowellpsychotherapy.com. Neill is spelt with an I. I'm also listed on the RO-DBT Find a Therapist website.
Great. And people can find out more resources and learn more about RO-DBT there as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of good research behind this approach. It's been around for 20 years, a number of clinical trials, and it's really gaining a lot of momentum right now. And it's great because it's really getting to some things that no other treatment has gotten to before.
Yeah, which is so promising.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today, Neill.
Sure, you're welcome. Thank you. This was fun.
It was. Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at BayAreaDBTCC.com. That's BayAreaDBTCC.com.